I think the breadth of U.S. sanctions is the kind of thing that I hadn't really realized when I started reporting. And the more I looked into it, the more I was just staggered by how many countries we have these programs on.
Which surprised you the most?
Let me just read the list of countries that we have.
I see you pulling up a list right now, and it's very long and detailed. Okay.
I will be very quick. I will not.
No, hit me with it.
This is an incomplete list. Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Syria, Cuba, Yemen, Afghanistan, Russia, China, Burma, Libya, Sudan, Belarus, Lebanon, Mali, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Nicaragua, Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo.
I'm very impressed with how quickly you said that partial list.
That's my co-host, Elahe Azadi, talking with reporter Jeff Stein. Jeff covers economics for The Post. That includes covering the Treasury Department. And for almost a year now, he has been working on a project to understand why the U.S. government has been imposing a lot more sanctions now than it ever has before.
And I am on the Treasury Department's news listserv where they email all the reporters what they're up to. And I kind of noticed that it felt like every single day I was getting another email from them with another sanction being imposed in another country or on another person that I had never heard of. And it led me down this rabbit hole of, wait, how often do we do this? How often are these things being imposed? And what I found was that the reason I felt like they were in my inbox every day with another press release about this was because, in fact, we have massively increased the use of this tool. And I didn't want that unexamined. I wanted to look at what that actually meant.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Monday, August 19th. Even if you're not an economics reporter like Jeff, you may have heard some news recently about the U.S. imposing sanctions on this country or that country. There's the latest push last week from the Treasury Department to sanction the Houthi and Hezbollah trade networks. Those are Iran-backed groups. Or when it came to the Venezuela elections. The autocratic leader, Nicolas Maduro, is refusing to step down despite what's internationally viewed as overwhelming evidence that he lost. And there have been critics of the U.S. government saying that, in this case, sanctions didn't work.
The Biden-Kamala Harris administration removed sanctions from Venezuela. And why did they remove these sanctions? They exchanged supposed removal of sanctions for supposed free and transparent elections. What we just saw was not free and transparent.
Every once in a while, the news of U.S. sanctions will bubble up. And every time it does, there's a part of me that thinks to myself, why? So today on the show, Elahe dives deep with Jeff on the why of economic sanctions. What exactly are they meant to do? And why is the U.S. ramping up its reliance on these tools that don't always work?
So, Jeff, I think before we talk about anything else, let's just start with a baseline of what are sanctions? How would you define the term economic sanctions?
Economic sanctions are the tool that the U.S. government uses when it deems a foreign government, a foreign person, a foreign company to represent a threat to either the U.S. national security or its foreign policy or even the U.S. economy. A sanction is not a criminal offense. If you've been sanctioned, you're not being charged with a crime, but it makes it a crime for anyone else to do business with you. If you are sanctioned, you are someone that other people cannot interact with, sometimes can't even talk to. To take one example, North Korea, its government has been sanctioned by the U.S. for decades. And what that means is that if you're a Western bank or you're an American company or you are just a normal person who wants to buy something from North Korea, it is now a crime for you to buy something for the North Korean government. And that is the basic precept that gets then applied to all kinds of governments, people, companies, et cetera.
All right. So it's an economic pariah. When did the U.S. first start using sanctions as a tool? Take me back.
Since the dawn of the Republic, the U.S. government has used economic measures to respond to foreign threats. Thomas Jefferson famously in the early 1800s tried closing off all U.S. trade with Great Britain. It was a disaster. It failed. But it showed that this is a tool kit that the U.S. has been playing with for a long time. But really, the modern sanctions regime emerges with the U.S. embargo, the blockade of Cuba in the 1960s.
Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
And a little before that with the response to the North Korean invasion of South Korea in the 1950s. That's when the modern regime of sanctions first emerges.
So how did it evolve from there? And were these policies actually effective?
Really, since sanctions emerged as a tool of U.S. policy in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a limit to how effective they were. And the limit was that we lived in this world in which the Soviet Union counterbalanced and provided sort of a counterweight to the U.S. government. So if the U.S. tried cutting off a country, an adversary, from trading with anyone else, that country could always still turn to the Soviet Union. And if the Soviet Union cut off a country, it could turn to the U.S. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. becomes the global superpower, both militarily, as most people know, but also economically. And so in the 1990s and 2000, you start to see the ramp up of the tools of economic warfare into what it becomes today.
So when you say a ramp up, what does that even look like? Like, what is the state of play with economic sanctions? Just so we understand how ubiquitous they are. Or are they ubiquitous? Are they popular?
It's very clear that after the fall of the Soviet Union, and then particularly starting with the George W. Bush administration, the use of sanctions has just exploded from a few hundred a year under Bush.
With this new effort, the United States will more aggressively enforce existing sanctions against Sudan's government.
To thousands, several thousands a year.
To put it simply, Russia just announced that it is carving out a big chunk of Ukraine.
Being imposed in the Biden administration.
So today, I'm announcing the first tranche of sanctions to impose costs on Russia in response to their actions yesterday.
We went from roughly 5% of all countries facing some form of U.S. sanction to the number now being close to a third of all countries on Earth in some form, either on a business or a sector or a government official or the government itself. While that might not mean that every country is under a full embargo, these sanctions, even on individuals, can have really significant consequences because they could affect imports of critical goods to that country. Federica Coco, our data reporter who's been working with me on this project, found that roughly 60% of all low-income or poor countries face some form of U.S. sanctions today. It looks like sort of the hockey stick chart where you just see this vertical trend where the number just explodes to the point at which we now have 3 times as many sanctions as any other country in the world and over 15,000 sanctions currently in effect. So it's an incredible increase that the people who are in this space recognize as a tremendous change.
Why is that happening? Why did that trend line go up so dramatically? I mean, you talked about the fall of the Soviet Union and maybe that counterbalance is gone, but why is it such a popular policy tool among, it sounds like, every presidential administration?
Yeah, it's really been the case that every president since George Bush has increasingly fallen in love with this tool. And I think the reason has to do a lot with the failures of Iraq and Afghanistan, where we saw, obviously, tremendous military debacles where thousands of American servicemen were killed, and you saw sort of the horrific impact of the tools of military warfare since those invasions, in the early 2000s, and the struggle and frustration of U.S. presidents to get troops out. The American government has adjusted and shifted by using these tools in part, I think, to avoid the worst that came with the military invasions. And so
it's like using sanctions as a way to wage war without actually waging war or using any troops at all.
That's exactly right. It's occupying this space between doing nothing and going to war. And every day, right, something terrible happens in the world. And U.S. government officials, they have pressure. Each president has pressure when there's a horrible thing in Eastern Europe or Africa or Latin America or wherever in the world. When something horrible happens, the impulse, the pressure immediately builds on the president to do something about it.
We said we'd not send U.S. troops to fight Russian troops in Ukraine, but we would provide robust military assistance and try to unify the Western world against Russia's aggression. I said I would impose powerful sanctions on Russia.
And as the military options have seemed more and more catastrophic and more unpopular domestically, this is a way for presidents to say, I'm not doing nothing, but I'm not putting American troops in harm's way.
That's exactly what we said we would do, and we did.
And so that lines up really neatly with this surge of economic warfare. But as I think we can discuss, the way in which this seems more appealing and less bloody and less dangerous than putting soldiers in harm's way can in some ways elide or mask just how difficult the trade-offs can be from economic warfare as well.
After the break, Jeff and Elahe get into those trade-offs. Then, at the end of today's show, we'll be bringing you some scenes from the Democratic National Convention that kicks off today in Chicago. We'll be right back.
I know that you have looked into in your reporting whether this approach of economic sanctions by the United States government, whether they have or have not been effective tools for coercing certain kinds of behaviors out of the regimes of other countries. Are there any case studies that supporters of sanctions would point to and say, yes, they were effective?
Really, the main example that sanctions supporters point to again and again is the effort that the U.S. participated in the late 1980s to impose sanctions on apartheid South Africa. Slobodan Milosevic in the 1990s was discouraged by U.S. sanctions as a Serbian dictator. U.S. sanctions have also been applied by the Biden administration for roughly 2 years on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. Those sanctions have not prevented Putin from continuing to carry out his war in Ukraine, but a lot of people will say accurately that the sanctions have degraded Russia's long-term military capabilities and its long-term economic capabilities.
So I want to now turn to critics of sanctions. What do they say about their effectiveness, and what are the cases that they would point to and say that this clearly shows these are not useful?
There seem to be a lot of examples of U.S. sanctions programs that have lasted literally decades, not achieving what they originally intended to do. So, for instance, we have the paradigmatic example might be Cuba, where we've had sanctions for over 60 years, and the communist regime that took over with Fidel Castro is still in power. We've had sanctions on North Korea since the 1950s. The communist regime there remains in power. In Iran, U.S. sanctions have existed since the 1970s. The theocratic regime in Iran remains in power. And in all these instances, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, there are documented instances as well of the sanctions making it harder for civilian populations to get important critical supplies. And yet at the same time, the effects on these regions that we may have wanted to see have not yet materialized, and it's been decades and decades.
Is there any recent example you've been looking at?
So I've been spending a lot of time recently looking at U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, and there's a huge debate about the extent to which U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, particularly under Trump, starting from 2017 and ramping up through 2020, they were intended on responding to the brutal dictatorial regime of Nicolas Maduro, who was involved in tons of corruption, rounding up political dissidents, the regime credibly accused of human rights violations. And under Trump, there was a big movement encouraged by Republicans and Democrats in Congress to really tighten the economic screws to Venezuela in an attempt to encourage their opposition movement. But the way these sanctions worked in practice was they shut Venezuela's government and its biggest source of income, its oil sector, off really from the world economy. And the impact of sanctions to the Venezuelan economy is heavily debated. But if you take some of the estimates as credible, which I do, that sanctions contribute up to as much as a half of the economic impact on Venezuela, you are looking at, in Venezuela, the biggest decline of any economy not at war documented in modern history.
And so what does that mean for people living there?
And so you saw poverty spike tremendously, tons of instances of malnutrition, people not being able to get food supplies, hyperinflation. Tons, more than 7 million Venezuelans have left the country and fled, often to neighboring countries, but increasingly recently to the U.S. The impact on the healthcare system, which was deteriorating because Venezuelans were unable to buy sort of the critical medical goods. I will say, in large part because Maduro and the Venezuelan regime terribly mismanaged the economy of the country, but also because the U.S. sanctions made that a lot harder. The hope and thinking from the Biden team had been that the threat of sanctions would at least encourage Maduro to have a free and fair election. Venezuelans did go out to vote on July 28th, and it seems like the sanctions was not enough to prevent some irregularities in the election results. Sanctions, at a minimum, didn't seem to sway the Maduro regime to ensure that it stuck by the voting standards that the international community and that the U.S. wanted to see. And so we could spend 2 hours discussing how many civilians have been affected by U.S. sanctions in Iran, in North Korea, in Syria, in Cuba, in Yemen. And these are not small countries. We're talking tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people who are affected by these questions. And yes, I obviously have a lot to say about this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I hear what you're saying. And also, when I think about the goal of sanctions in some ways to coerce governments to behave differently, and if they're not doing that, then they're being heavily sanctioned. I mean, the people most impacted by those sanctions, who are they blaming? Like, are they blaming their own governments for maybe holding fast onto power for the sake of power, or, spending their money to wage war in another country and look, you've economically isolated us? Or are they blaming the United States for implementing these sanctions?
I think it's really hard, obviously, to speak to how, people feel in all these different countries. It's
so
such
different.
A huge number of countries, and you get such different views. There are lots of Cubans, especially people who are still there, I think tend to be more likely to blame the U.S. than people who made it out. People who tend to leave, I think it's also fair to say, tend to have a little bit more economic mobility. That's part of the reason why they make it out. And I think it's worth noting that in many cases, the people who are most supportive of sanctions sometimes will be the victims of atrocities from foreign governments. You see Venezuelan refugees often being quite supportive of economic warfare by the U.S. against Venezuela. The Cuban diaspora community tends to be very supportive. I don't want to overgeneralize, but tends to be supportive of the embargo and tough economic measures on Cuba. So this is not a binary. This is not, us and our reporting finding that sanctions are all unequivocally bad.
Yeah.
I think one other thread that I wanted to pick up on what you were saying is a big part of the problem with sanctions is that while the point is to push out the regime or to weaken it, sometimes we find that the elements of a country that are most likely to be able to oppose that regime are themselves counterintuitively and sort of perversely hurt by the sanctions. And so what I mean by that is sanctions will often, for instance, crack down on trade. And often who gets hit by that are legitimate businessmen, a growing, thriving private sector, people who can form a rival power base to the regime.
Oh, I see.
And when that happens, when legitimate private sector trade gets whittled down or weakened, often what happens, this happens in North Korea, in Syria, you see either corrupt actors or the autocratic regime step into that breach.
Jeff, did you speak to anyone in the U.S. government about how they're feeling about sanctions right now, about the way people are making these decisions, about when and where to level sanctions? What is the thinking right now within the government about this tool?
It's interesting. I've spoken to government officials across numerous departments about this, and what they all say, I have some sympathy for this. What they say is you look at the trend of sanctions, and many of them are okay, overall, we know this is a little out of control. This is an insane volume. But then, when it comes to each individual one, right, each one seems perfectly justified. So
and
it's
very reasonable.
And very reasonable. And they feel, I think, understandably, that they don't want to send the signal that the U.S. is okay with this or that terrible thing happening. So they're torn because, for instance, the Russia sanctions program is responsible for a huge part of the Biden administration's continued sanctions rise.
I see.
When Biden came in, his team recognized that sanctions had gotten out of control under Trump, and they started to do a process of seeing how can we ramp this down? How can we put some guardrails on this system? And then Russia came in and invaded Ukraine, and I don't want to say it went out the window, but the idea of ramping down sanctions was totally blown out of the water by the imperative to respond to this foreign policy crisis. But that kind of isn't just a one-off. It kind of reflects the root of the challenge here, which is that terrible things keep happening in the world that the U.S. feels compelled to respond to. Does that paradox make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to reduce it to this analogy, but it's like, okay, I have my shopping list. The total of what's here, the number is way too high. But then I'm like going down the list. I'm like, well, I need that. I need that. I need that. I can't like take this off. I can't take this off. We need this. We need this. And so then, yeah, you just end up with this number and you have this huge number, this final count that seems preposterous. But then it's like, where do you actually nix anything? That's sort of what I'm hearing you say.
Totally. And I think the other part of that is like when you go to pay for your groceries, you have to pay. And the thing with sanctions is that like there's no
accountability.
There's no budgetary cost. There's no accountability. You don't have to go to Congress and say, can we do this? You don't have to go to Congress and say, can I get a budget for this?
So is this one of the reasons that they've become so popular? Is it's actually not only are you not putting any soldier, U.S. soldier in harm's way, but you actually don't have to spend much to do it.
Totally. It's like
that
free.
makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
It's like, and you don't need Congress and you don't need that long of a process. And as I said at the beginning, you don't even need to accuse someone of having committed a crime.
Mm-hmm.
You just put them on a list of people that it becomes illegal to do business with. And there's almost, as we've seen, it just become an irresistible opportunity.
What about the people you spoke with in the administration or who have served previously about the calculations they have to make when deciding the human toll that these policies take on individuals within the country?
I think to give the Biden administration some credit, they have taken this more seriously than any prior administration. They are working quite diligently to deal with the unintended humanitarian consequences. And they have been pretty forceful in saying, if you are doing trade with a heavily sanctioned country and it's for food and medicine, et cetera, we really want to see that activity continue. The problem is that by many measures, the humanitarian crises facing countries under sanctions continue to get worse, even though the Biden administration is trying to encourage this kind of activity. And that's because to get something into a country, you often need a bank to process a transaction. And from the bank's perspective, they are very unwilling to take the risk of processing something that could be going to a country that is under sanctions and that they could end up being penalized for processing and for allowing to happen.
And then probably on the flip side, not a good look.
And the thing is, they are terrified of the U.S. government saying, actually, you approved this transaction thinking it was humanitarian aid, but actually some of that money went to the Ayatollah cronies or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so they're like, why am I going to touch that? I'm not going to get involved at all.
Yeah, not even worth it.
And Treasury at the same time is like, we're telling you to do it. It's okay. But the banks are like, you can't force us. And so even though the Biden administration is, I think, doing things that they see as helping this situation, it's very, very hard when a sanction is imposed on a lot of a country, or sanctions are heavily imposed on a country, to protect innocent people, even if the sanction overall is designed to protect those people from a potentially really terrible regime.
You know, towards the start of this conversation, we talked about why sanctions became popular, and they're this viewed as a sanitized or quote unquote nonviolent tool, short of physical warfare. If sanctions aren't used, what other alternative does there exist if the U.S. does want to influence policy or, to send a message or to truly isolate some terrible actors?
Some advocates of sanctions who worry about the unintended consequences have really pushed this idea of smart sanctions, which means essentially that the U.S., instead of targeting a whole country or cutting off a whole country from trade, will say, we will sanction individuals, we will sanction particular companies, we will sanction cronies or military leaders tied to some corrupt action. The problem with that, though, is if you're going after a government official who might be corrupt, and that government official is responsible for signing the paperwork that allows imports to come into the country, you can still have unintended consequences for civilian populations. And I think that's why some people are arguing that if we're going to keep using this tool, we have to have a much broader awareness of the things that it can do accidentally, even if that doesn't mean we need to stop using it. You know, I spoke to Ben Rhodes, who was Obama's deputy national security advisor, and I asked him a version of this question. And his answer I thought was interesting, which was he was not saying that sanctions are bad or that we shouldn't use them or we shouldn't apply them, but that the impulse to respond to every problem in the world with a solution that seems to lack collateral damage, we have to start rethinking that. We have to see sanctions as having these consequences. And if diplomacy fails and if the U.S. can't dissuade someone from doing something terrible, we can't just say sanctions are the answer to everything no matter what. We have to wrestle with the documented trade-offs and not just see them as something without consequence.
Jeff, thanks so much for joining me.
Love being on Post Reports. Thanks for having me.
Jeff Stein is a White House economics reporter for The Post. He spent a year digging into every aspect of U.S. sanctions. If you're interested in reading more deep dives about their effects, you can find that reporting at the link in our show notes or at WashingtonPost.com. Jeff spoke with my co-host, Elahe Izadi. Elahe has been having a busy week. She's now in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention, where she has been watching as the party's elite gets ready to celebrate Vice President Kamala Harris in a big arena downtown.
So we are now walking into the United Center. If I can open the door.
Mic 1, check 1, 2.
After a security guard did that mic check, producer Ariel Plotnick and I went inside the United Center, where workers were getting ready for the big week ahead. Like LaPortia Hunt. She's worked in concessions here for 15 years, and she said this event feels unlike any other she's worked.
Today we have a little special menu. We normally serve chicken tenders and burgers and things like that, but they added a couple of new items for this event. The plant-based chicken tenders, Impossible burgers, things of that nature, Caesar salads.
And did they prep you in any different way to be prepared for this event? Like what it's going to be like?
Well, we always give it 110% overall anyway, so we know we have to give it 110%.
I'll let you get back to it. It was so nice.
I'll come by.
So the vibe I'm getting is, before the doors open at a restaurant, where all the prep cooks are out, everyone's getting everything together, and you just know in just a few hours everything is going to change. Tonight, all eyes will be on the stage inside the arena. So we went to check it out during a rare moment of calm. So we're on the floor of the United Center, standing on bright royal blue carpet, where the Pennsylvania delegation will be seated in just a few hours. And the only other thing I'd say is this is normally where the Chicago Bulls play. And I'm thinking the greats, Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, all these people played on this floor.
You're walking on hallowed grounds.
I am walking on hallowed NBA basketball grounds. And it's crazy that now that floor is covered in carpets and chairs where people will be sitting in a few hours, and there's all these different state delegations that will be sitting here, but it'll be interesting to see how enthusiastic people feel or if there's any dissent and just what that scene will be also tonight with President Biden speaking. Some of that tension is already playing out at a protest outside the convention center. So we're at Union Park in Chicago, about a 15-minute walk from where the DNC is taking place. And there is a protest here. It's the March on the DNC, and it's to protest the Biden administration's handling of the war in Gaza. And we spoke with a protester named Evan Thompson. He lives in Chicago and said he had this protest marked on his calendar for months.
I came out here to show to the Democrats at the National Convention that there needs to be an arms embargo on Israel now. And there needs to be a ceasefire in Gaza now. And we won't take any more lip service from the Democrats. We want action immediately.
And just being here, like you said, you want to send a message. What would it take for people like you to feel like you could vote for a Democratic nominee for Kamala Harris to be president?
It would take an arms embargo on Israel. Kamala Harris has said that she wants a ceasefire, but so did Joe Biden, and no action has taken place. So we're kind of sick of the lip service, and we need action. But yeah, an arms embargo mainly.
And I guess the last question I'd ask is, we've heard this talk from Democrats of, but do you think a President Trump would do any better on this issue? What would you say to that?
I would say that you guys are doing the same thing. I mean, at the end of the day, there's the argument of the lesser evil, but at the end of the day, our vote is supposed to represent who we want in office, and presidential candidates have to win our vote. We're not, I'm not just going to vote for Kamala because Trump is worse.
Evan said he's considering voting for a third-party candidate. Organizers of the coalition to march on the DNC had predicted that tens of thousands of people would show up. But by early afternoon, fewer than 2,000 protesters were at the park. Even though the crowd was smaller, some people still traveled a long way to be there. Faija Rishek is a Palestinian-American who came to Chicago from Dallas. She says she hopes protests later this week are bigger, but that their presence today is still important.
They saying we are here. We're not gonna just give you a consent to send more money to kill more Palestinian children and women and men and bomb church and mosque, killing journalists, teacher. They commit everything you can imagine. I mean, I cannot believe that we have massacres live stream on the TV and we are just watching. How could we just sitting on our couch and watching people being slaughtered?
Across the street, about a dozen or so counter-protesters from a suburban church also showed up. One of them was Tom Moffat, who was out showing support for Israel.
And unfortunately, right now, with what's transpired over the last several months, as unfortunate as it is, they have responded in the way that they felt best. I just know that there's people that don't want these people to exist.
And when you say these people, you're waving an Israeli flag.
I'm waving the Israeli flag.
Yeah. There was a heavy police presence at the park where the city is expecting more protests throughout the week. We'll be back in your feeds tomorrow to talk about President Biden's historic speech at the DNC tonight. See you soon.
Again, that was Elahe Izadi in Chicago. She'll be there all week with our colleagues from the politics team. And if you want to hear more of their coverage, subscribe to the Campaign Moment podcast, where they will be bringing you an inside look at the convention and what it all means. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced by Rennie Svirnovsky with help from Trinity Webster Bass. The reporting you heard from the DNC, that was by Elahe and Ariel Plotnick. The show was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Rena Flores with help from Lucy Perkins. Thanks also to Mike Madden and Molly Hennessy-Fisk. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.